This podcast accompanies the acclaimed new docuseries In the Eye of the Storm, which follows the remarkable journey of maverick economist, politician and whistleblower Yanis Varoufakis. Both the series and podcast explore the connections between power, democracy, capitalism and the deepening crises of civilization. The series is available to watch now. Details in the description. Enjoy the conversation.
It seems that the situation is worsening, the risks are increasing. I'd love to just hear your summary of where we are on the international stage at this point.
Thanks, Raoul, and thanks so much for inviting me onto the call. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I was walking down a road in my constituency yesterday. It's a public holiday, so everybody was quite relaxed. And I met this woman walking. She was chatting, and she said, "You know, Jeremy, it's a bit weird that nobody ever talks about peace anymore. All the news is only ever about war." And I said, well, to begin with, I thought, "Oh, yeah, what are you saying that to me for?" She said, no, it's not about you. It's about the generality of it. And of course, she's right. We had a huge demonstration on Saturday again about Gaza. 250,000 came. And that's the 13th national demonstration we've held in London since October. And we've got plenty more planned. We're going to carry on holding them as long as necessary. But the death toll is appalling, and the public are almost becoming anaesthetised to the idea that it's somehow or other a legitimate military target to bomb a hospital. And then move it on a bit. The news yesterday that apparently Israel has bombed the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing a number of people. Clearly, there's an intention by somebody, probably Israel, to widen the war to include Iran. And then the background to this the whole time is the war in Ukraine and the continual supply of weapons by mainly Western Europe and the USA to Ukraine, and then at the same time supply of a large amount of weaponry from China, probably other countries through Russia to continue that war. So we have this huge build-up of conflict all over the world, and obviously the ever-present danger that NATO and Russia have both got access to nuclear weapons. Israel has access to nuclear weapons. And we seem to me to be in almost a pre-First World War situation, where a series of interlocking security pacts begin to kick in, and we then get into something really, really dangerous. And the language of peace is never used. It's only about levels of conflict and intensity of conflict. And in the case of Britain, our military expenditure, called defence expenditure, is set to rise to 2.5% of GDP from just under 2%. There are serious demands to raise it to 3%, which would be enormous by any stretch of the imagination. And at the same time, local government services, which are key providers of social services, are all being cut back for lack of money. So it is the debate about peace and peace alternatives and the causes of war that we have to have. And just finish before we go over to Yanis, that through our project, the Peace and Justice Project, we've been talking and thinking about this quite a lot. And we're publishing a book in September, a live book, in the sense it's going to be something that's subject to a lot of public meetings and discussion about the power of the global arms trade, with Andrew Feinstein and others involved in it. Because it seems to me that the power of lobbying and the motor force behind all this is the enormous influence of the arms and aircraft industry on the world, and providing ever more lethal forms of weaponry to kill people. And at the end of it, we now have 32,000 dead in Gaza, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of dead in the Ukraine-Russia war. And any conflict with Iran is going to kick off into thousands more. And other wars barely reported, such as the ongoing conflict in the Congo, essentially funded by the mining interests of the world in order to get hold of cobalt and coltan. And so we need to have this serious discussion about how you bring about not just a stop fighting, actual peace, which is about investment in people and social needs.
Yeah. Yanis, what are your thoughts?
Well, the conversation you had on the streets of Islington with one of your neighbors reaffirms the decision of DiEM25 and Mera25, our political movement here in the European Union, to run in the European Parliament elections in June under the triple banner of peace, dignity, and freedom. And peace being the first, of course, the number one, because Jeremy described perfectly the global warmongering, the fanning of the flames of various wars. What we have here, from my perspective, anyone who knows how the State Department and how the Pentagon works in the United States knows that it's not homogeneous. There are different offices within the State Department, within the Pentagon, and they're quite independent, and sometimes they even clash with one another. I first came to terms with this, or became aware of that, because in the case of Greece's military dictatorship, there were two coup d'etats being planned, one by the Pentagon and one by the CIA, independently of one another. They more or less had a little war between them. The military officers supported by the CIA versus the ones supported by the Pentagon. And the reason why I mention that is because it is important to understand the war in Ukraine as being one project of Washington, and the new Cold War against China, which is feeding and reinforcing the war in Ukraine, being pursued by a different part of the American administration. So I remember 12, 13 years ago, I was having a discussion with the former chief of staff of NATO, American chief of staff, in Brussels. And he was a Republican appointee, George W. Bush man, not somebody that would be associated in any shape or form with the left. And he was making the argument privately to me that NATO was obsolete and Europe should not want it. That's a George W. Bush man, chief of staff of NATO. And I said to him, so why are you pursuing, why is the United States, and of course their lackeys in London, in Brussels, in Norway, and so on, in Greece, why are they continuing with this NATO business? And he said to me, well, there are three reasons. One is to keep Russia out. The second one is to keep us in, the United States. And the third one is to keep Germany down. Keep Germany down. I think that was quite a significant statement. And you can see that the war in Ukraine achieved all three. The German economy is now in the process of deindustrialization as a result of the war in Ukraine. Not just that, but it's an important part of it. And that was a project that has been running along NATO. Victoria Nuland since 2013, 2014, pushing that line. But then another part of the American administration has been, under both Trump and Biden, pushing for the new Cold War against China. And you know this, Raul, you've heard me talk about this before. I think that the reason for that is not Taiwan. It's nothing to do with the Chinese becoming uppity. It's got to do with the fact that China is the only country in the world that has a very large concentration of the new form of capital, which is ruling societies today. I call it cloud capital, algorithmic capital. China is the only country in the world that has a competitor to Google, to Facebook, to Amazon, to financial apps, and so on. And this is the long-term strategy behind Biden's ban on microchips. But the new Cold War, which is happening against China, and the traditional NATO expansionism in Ukraine, they are sort of converging, they're coalescing. Because for instance, um, the freezing of around $450 billion worth of Russian central bank money. I'm not judging it, I'm just stating it for a fact. By freezing hundreds of billions of dollars of Russian um, central bank money, essentially, the United States and Europe have signaled to oligarchs in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, all over Europe, for that matter, that their money is not safe in the dollar payment system. And a lot of that money is now being shifted over to the digital payment system of the Chinese, which is also at the same time being utilized by Putin in order to bypass the Western sanctions. So the two wars are, even though, in my view, in my analysis, they are motivated by different parts of the American establishment, they are coalescing to create an overall, a global dynamic that feeds the warmongering that we discussed before, that we're discussing here. Now, Israel is always a show of its own, because the Nakba started in 1948. It continues to this day. What's happening in Gaza is just a direct extension of that. Israel has agency. I'm not so sure that Biden is happy with the bombing of the consulate in Damascus. Of course, he is completely, utterly spineless, and he will never oppose it. And he won't. He will provide them with even more bombs to do it, even if it's not part of his planning. But it doesn't matter, because in the end, as successive Israeli governments have proven, it is their warmongering and their perpetual war project, which now coalesces with the never-ending war in Ukraine project of the United States, because that's what the United States want, to keep Germany down, to keep Russia out, and to keep themselves in, and also to keep selling us here in Europe hugely expensive liquefied natural gas from Texas and New Mexico. They need to continue this war. So the interests of the people of Ukraine, who are the people who have been invaded. For whatever reason, Putin invaded, the people of Ukraine need to be supported as the victims of an invasion, in the same way that the Gazans should be supported, not just the Gazans, but the Palestinians overall, because their country, their homes, their olive groves have been occupied. Nevertheless, the point I'm making is that the champions of the people of Ukraine, in the form of Boris Johnson, of Rishi Sunak, of now Emmanuel Macron, who wants to send, he claims he wants to send, he's just such a coward that he would never do it, but he claims he wants to do it in order to improve his ratings prior to the European Parliament election. Macron, I'm referring to. They are presenting themselves as the champions of the people in Ukraine, but they are the grave diggers of the people of Ukraine, because this war was never going to end militarily. It can never be won by either side. There are only losers on both sides. DiEM25, we've been saying from the very first moment that the only solution would be a kind of peace process under the United Nations auspices, with an agreement that the question of Crimea is kicked into the long grass to be discussed in the United Nations along the solution of the Cyprus issue for the next 50 years, with an immediate ceasefire, the return of the Russian troops to their barracks, with a commitment of the West that Ukraine is not going to become part of NATO, even if it is something like along the lines of the Austria solution during the Cold War. And the Donbas area can become an area a bit like Northern Ireland, with a Good Friday kind of agreement, with essential dual sovereignty. And that proposal that we've been making now for 2 years, which was ridiculed and was completely demonized as being Putin's agenda, is now going to be the best case scenario for the people of Ukraine. After 200,000, 300,000 people have died, we're going to end up where we should have been in the first place. But it is functional. This mega death, whether it is in Yemen, whether it is in Gaza, where it is in Ukraine, potentially in the South China Seas, if the Cold War becomes a hot war between the United States and China. This megadebt is functional to the interests of maintaining American hegemony in a world where the American capacity to produce stuff, to manufacture in the capitalist way stuff, is shrinking to less than 9% of total GDP. And that is the price we have to pay, this warmongering for maintaining American hegemony, even though economically, in terms of actually making things, the United States is insignificant these days.
When I think about this situation, I always come back to the fact that history cannot repeat itself given the technology that now exists. So since August 6th, 1945, and the dropping of the nuclear bomb on Japan, we've had a technology that we've known we cannot use. And I think one way of understanding all that happened after 1945 is an attempt to redesign the international order to prevent major conflict between the superpowers. The UN, the Bretton Woods system, and so on. Are we seeing a breakdown of that international order now? And is that in part a generational thing that we forget the lessons that were learnt about the value of peace?
The world has moved a great deal since 1945, but the political structures have not moved with it. The UN structure is essentially a North Atlantic construction of the end of the Second World War. Britain, France, USA, Russia, permanent members of the Security Council. China, in its earlier Taiwan form and later in the People's Republic form, also part of it because it's such a large country. The rest of the world not represented except by election to the Security Council on a termly basis, and they don't have powers of veto either. NATO was, yes, created in 1948 in formal sense, but actually it came back to the Atlantic Charter of 1942 when Churchill and Roosevelt essentially planned the post-World War scenario where there would be a domination by the US with British support. Even Churchill recognized the British Empire was coming to an end. But we now have a situation where the US economy is a completely different animal than it was then. It is no longer the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, that is China. The natural resources of the world are in part exhausted in the USA, almost completely exhausted in most of Europe. The natural resources of the world lie in Africa and Latin America, and those are the areas where there is huge potential conflict coming down the line. In reality, already happening in the Congo, which is the biggest, most mineral-rich country in Africa. And so we do have an incredibly dangerous situation. But the other scenario, which is that whilst the 1945 to 50 construct was done by nation states with a very strong military basis, they all had huge armies, they all had huge military capabilities, all of them did at that stage. We now have a world power system that is much more dependent on the lobbying power and the financial power of huge corporations who move vast amounts of money around the world, really not very concerned about what nation states think. And they are more powerful and totally unaccountable in any form. And if we're serious about a peaceful, more democratic world, you have to start facing up to that reality. And so Yanis's experience in finance and economics, I mean, Yanis, do you think there's any way we can ever bring these huge mega corporations under any sort of accountability and control?
In short, the answer is a very disappointing no. It cannot be done through the standard types of regulation which regulated, let's say, Standard Oil or Rockefeller under Theodore Roosevelt. Because these days, the fossil fuel industry is destroying the planet. There's no doubt about that. But they are struggling to extract the last drop of oil or the last drop of surplus value from the rest of us. They know that they are done. They have another decade or so. Whether they will be done before the planet is done or vice versa, I have no idea. I'm not very optimistic about that. But the main game now is not the fossil fuel industry. The main game are what I call the cloudalists, the owners of this cloud capital, the algorithmic capital that lives inside our phones. And let me be very, very precise here. My latest calculations show that around 35% of global GDP, of global income, 35%, is now siphoned off by these tech companies. The companies that I call cloudalists because they own the cloud. It's not just Amazon.com. It's not just Deliveroo. It's not just Uber. It's not just Airbnb. Let me give you an example which I find startling. In Indonesia, anybody who's been to Indonesia will have noticed for decades now, for a century now, as you're driving in rural areas, you'll find that there are these warungs. The warungs are tiny little kiosks. Some of them are on wheels that sell everything from drinks to food stuff to SIM cards for your phone. 3.5 million. Get that number. 3.5 million of these warungs have been purchased in the last 3 years by these cloudalist firms, including Jeff Bezos's enterprises, a personal company belonging to Jeff Bezos, which is on the side of Amazon, in order to financialize the people in those villages through the warungs, which are now completely automated. They have become all networked using applications and what I call cloud capital. I'm saying this so that people don't think that I'm only talking about Amazon.com, which is a very Western thing. Right? This cloud capital is where the game is now. Where the reason why I'm talking about the transition from capitalism to techno-feudalism is because these are digital fiefdoms that the owners of these algorithms have created, in which they have encased both consumers, citizens, and producers, vassal capitalists, from whom they extract 30-40% of profits. So every time you buy something of them, it's a little bit like calling an Uber driver a capitalist. Yeah, I mean, he's a capitalist in the sense that he owns his car, he's got a bit of capital, and he's an entrepreneur, right? But he's not really. He's a vassal to Uber. Similarly with the Varung, similarly to anyone who sells anything on Amazon or similar devices. Walmart, the huge supermarket network in the United States, has shifted to the cloud now. There is Walmart Net, which is making more money than the physical stores. So, we used to say that financial capital and financialization and globalization was all about money, going from one part of the earth to the other at the touch of a button without any country, any government, any regulator being to do anything about that. Well, now this is the case with rents extracted, about 35% of rents from around the world, being of income from around the world, being extracted by these cloud capitalists. And of course, even if you look whether you're looking at the rural areas of Indonesia or the New York Stock Exchange. Now, the New York Stock Exchange essentially is being controlled by three companies: BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And more than that, 80% of the value of the New York Stock Exchange are these 7 cloud capital firms like Google, the Magnificent Seven. Mm-hmm. If you take out of the New York Stock Exchange these 7 cloudalist companies, then the rest is in a state of huge crisis. It's really not accumulating any capital. So you have this amazing development, and therefore you have the clash between the American and the Chinese cloud capital. Europe is completely absent. The United Kingdom is completely absent. We simply play no role in that. And that explains to a very large extent why, the Americans say jump and we say how high when it comes to, fanning the flames of war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine is simply a way of maximizing the last rents of the fossil fuel industry in the United States, while at the same time, from the perspective of Putin, is his way of having a never-ending war that keeps him in power and in control of the Kremlin. So the people of Russia, the people of Ukraine, the people of the United States, of the United Kingdom, of the European Union, we have periodic elections, but we elect people who have, firstly, they have no idea of what's going on. And secondly, they really cannot regulate. So going back to my disappointing answer to your pertinent question, Jeremy, no, we cannot control. This is why we need an international, uprising. This is why we leftists had, even though we have failed in every regard in the last 100 years, we had the right idea that internationalism, activism at a global level, becoming, having a strategy, not just for our neighborhood, not just for our city, not just for our country, but for how to counter the manner in which cloud capital and the fossil fuel industry are combining forces essentially to blow up the world.
Do you think that cloud capital is being fused with the arms trade, as cloud capital is necessary to train AI, and AI is becoming central to weapons and warfare?
Well, you can see in Ukraine now that this is a war between autonomous systems to a very large extent. I mean, you have First World War on the ground, trench warfare, people just lobbing missiles at one another, just killing each other, but not moving at all, right? So you've got First World War on the ground, and you've got 21st century AI-driven machines in the air. It's the worst of all worlds, of today's world and of the First World War, the Great War era. Now, what I find fascinating is that, I've talked to quite a few of the technologists in Silicon Valley and some of them in China. The people who actually designed the AI, who coded, they are all on the same page as we are. They are shit scared, to use a scientific term, of what they are creating. And they keep I don't know whether you've noticed that, but AI designers, even some AI companies, are warning governments that, we are creating something which is really very exciting, but at the same time we fear for the future of humankind. And it's not so much that, there will be, in the terms of the Terminator movies, the moment of the singularity where the machines are going to become conscious and decide that human beings are surplus to requirements and wipe us out. That's not around the corner. It may happen in a century, but that's not the point. When you have a drone, or actually a swarm of small drones, think of a swarm made up of 1,000 drones. These exist today. They are available for sale. You can buy a swarm of drones. They can go into a building with face recognition AI and decide on their own whom to take out and whom not to take out on the basis of instructions that were received. They're not even controlled anymore remotely, like the American drones are that kill people in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on. These are complete, you press the button, they fly off, you can't stop them. They go into a building and they, out of 1,000 people, they choose 20 to kill. Now, this happens today. Do I care that they are not truly intelligent? I don't. So if you combine the huge stakes for the cloud capitalists, the fossil fuel industry, the power of the AI that is being developed, and the powerlessness of our elected politicians even to know what on earth is happening, this combination is a clear and pleasant danger for humanity, let alone the fact that these same algorithms poison our democracies by poisoning the conversation between citizens so that we can't even have a proper discussion amongst themselves about the climate catastrophe. So from wherever you look at it, we are being quick marched to extinction by our own artifacts. So Mary Shelley was extremely prescient. We've created a beast that is beyond our control, Not because the problem is not the technology. The problem is who owns the stuff, who owns the technologies, which is the old Marxist critique of capitalism.
I would suggest it's about ownership, but it's not only ownership. It's also about transcending these traps that we often see, that we've talked about before, Yanis, in game theory, the traps of arms races, of first mover advantage, of tragedy of the commons. They're difficult to escape from, and they can account for a large proportion of the crises that we're seeing at the civilizational level. If you go and talk to most politicians, and as you were talking about the AI technologists, the rationalization will always be, yeah, we're shit scared and this is terrible, but if we don't do it, China are going to do it. And then you go and speak to China, and China will say the same thing. And the same argument with fossil fuel or overfishing in the oceans. The idea is if we don't do it, someone else will do it, because we don't yet have the global cooperation mechanisms to escape those traps and enforce decisions which would be in the benefit of the majority.
Look, this is all good and proper, and you're right. But I do believe that it all boils down to ownership. Because if those AI programs were owned by communities, by the demos, it wouldn't get to the point of the prisoner's dilemma. Because, to compare Uber with a cooperative of taxi drivers using an algorithm in order to regulate their work and to help us use them in a way which is efficient from the perspective of the user, of the customer, of that cooperative of taxi drivers. Okay, they wouldn't have any reason to create an algorithm which is predatory, like the Uber algorithm is predatory towards the user's data, towards the drivers, towards the other people in taxi drivers in another country. So it's who owns the algorithms that determines whether, in the end, the AI scientists or coders are being forced to write AI programs which are predatory. If you work for OpenAI, which now has Microsoft behind it, right? Even if you are a communist, right? Your job depends on writing a piece of AI which is predatory. That's not because of who you are, and that you have a choice between quitting or doing as Microsoft says. So ownership is everything in the end. That's why democratically controlled cooperatives using the highest of technology are the ones that will create the international institutions that do away with war. It will not be the international institutions that will then create the circumstances of peace and defund the conglomerates.
Jeremy, what
Yeah,
are your thoughts?
very interesting concept there. There's been as you probably know, argument within the London taxi industry for about 20 years now, in that the black cab drivers were highly knowledgeable. They have to know every street in London, highly experienced, and doing pretty well. And then came along two things. One is Google Maps, which can direct anybody anywhere at the drop of a hat, so you don't actually need to know anything. You just follow a little screen in front of you and tell you where to drive. And secondly, the Uber app, which means that anybody can get a cab from anywhere within 2 or 3 minutes at the most. And whereas when you get an old black cab, you'd stand by the road and wait for one to come by, and you might have a very long wait. And so to begin with, the London cabbies then set up a huge campaign against Uber to try and get rid of Uber out of the city. Whereas in reality, what my view they should have been doing was spending a great deal of energy in developing their own technology as well, which latterly they've started to do, which is run by the taxi drivers themselves. And that way you can sort of autonomize the taxi industry in one city. And these same arguments and disputes are taking place all over the world. But Yanis is right. The ownership of the algorithms is the key to it all. And these the algorithmic power around the world is absolutely enormous. I mean, you look at your phone, you look at your computer, what news pops up in front of you? I mean, I'm getting quite annoyed with this particular computer I'm looking at the moment. Every time I turn it on, it brings up articles from the Daily Express. I've no idea why, except I suspect that at some point, probably a year ago, I was interested in an article in the Daily Express, and the algorithm has decided that I am the archetypal Daily Express reader. So I get bombarded with stuff from the Daily Express day in, day out. Now that is an incredibly powerful app that can direct me into a certain direction. And the political power of that is huge. And the power of that to promote debate is also very significant. Now, back to the Daily Express analogy, I turn on my computer and I'm routinely told that Putin is mad, that Putin's about to die from cancer, that Putin is about to be overthrown by a coup, that half the Russian forces have already defected and gone away, but all it needs is a few more weapons and a few more troops and a few more support for Ukraine, and Ukraine is going to defeat Russia in this war. I mean, the ghastly horror is that all countries around the world are involved to some extent, Western Europe and Russia, obviously, and China to the most, in pouring money and weapons into Ukraine, and several 100,000 people have already died. I have no sympathy whatsoever for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I have every sympathy for all those that have died, be they Russians or Ukrainians, in this. And so it is the power of algorithms to decide how we think that is a really, really serious one politically. I'm writing a book at the moment on partly on my experience as leader of the opposition, but also other issues as well. And the most interesting and the hardest part to write is the one on the media for the future, because the power of the media to influence opinion and the power of social media to reduce people's concentration spans to a couple of hundred characters at the most is huge. And it means getting more complicated arguments across is much more difficult. And so I don't have a simple answer to this, but I do know that the left needs to be developing its own autonomous form of media information. But if we rely on Facebook, on Amazon and Google, YouTube, etc., to disseminate our knowledge, quite often it happens, they do it, we put lots of interesting stuff up, but we all do it and all use it. But, and this is the big but, when it becomes inconvenient for those in enormous power, for us to have that ability to communicate with each other, they can simply shut it down, as was done in India, as has been done in China, as has been done in Russia, as has been done on a city basis and local basis all over Western Europe and the USA at various times. We need the technical and knowledgeable ability to be able to put up some kind of alternative.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, and I'm just going to push back a little bit on what you said before, Yanis. Of course, ownership is central, but scale is also central. And we need shifts of ownership, but we need them at an international scale, and we need a new international architecture to facilitate cooperation and forms of decision-making that can enable a shift of ownership at scale. Because if you have Europe or you have the US or you have one region of the world doing exactly as you say and what we'd like to see, using resources in a much more efficient, rational way, taking ownership of algorithms, that's beautiful. But if another part of the world decides to say, no, we're going to weaponize all of this technology, they will have the power in short order to wipe out the more progressive example. That's why I think the problem, when you really get to the heart of it, is not just about ownership, it's about a new international architecture which facilitates cooperation. I think of the book by Daniel Ellsberg, The Doomsday Machine, where he talks about just how close we've come as a civilization to obliterating ourselves with nuclear weapons. a number of times, not simply through malicious intent, but through a series of accidents, which led to nuclear weapons almost being launched, which could have triggered a nuclear winter and pretty much the end of humanity. Now, nuclear weapons have been around for a blink of an eye, given human history. And since then, the technologies and the means for self-destruction have proliferated, and they're proliferating rapidly with AI. So, yes, we have to shift ownership, but unless we have a way of cooperating, and it's really getting back to what you said at the start, Jeremy, peace is an active state. It's not simply the absence of conflict. We need structures and a culture that can really facilitate and deliver that peace. Because for the first time in human history, it's literally a matter of survival for the species and our civilization. Conflict in the past didn't wipe out everything. So we need to update our social technologies to meet the challenges that our physical technologies are bringing. That's my position. Is there something that you think is wrong there, or you disagree with, or is it just a matter of language?
You have to add to that education and information. We have the greatest access to information and knowledge there has ever been in human history. And yet we have people directed down rabbit holes by algorithms to take them away from access to that knowledge. I mean, this thing here, mobile phone, normal mobile phone, I can access all the knowledge of any library in the world at the drop of a few buttons. That's incredible power. Do people access that? No. Do they research detailed into history of subjects? No. They're often taken off in the direction of illusions of celebrity, of money, of wealth, and all the rest of it. So we actually have a de-informed and depoliticized generation that's being encouraged by these media systems. And so surely the political issue is how you inform and mobilize people in an age when you're in competition with everything else digitally. I'm not sure what the simple answer to this is, but the reality of war, the reality of insecurity, economic insecurity, is a huge one. And I should imagine the figures are roughly the same across Europe. In the case of the UK, working class living standards have fallen by around 20% over the past 15 years and continue to fall. Even where there are successful wage claims, they're no more than the rate of inflation. And so we're on a redistribution, a massive post-COVID, post-2008 redistribution of wealth, and with it the power, in the direction of the very biggest corporations, which Yanis so effectively described.
Right. I want to push back on Raoul's hypothesis, which I consider to be very West-centric. You see, and what hypothesis is this? What you said before, that if we don't develop these lethal weapons and these lethal techniques and so on, somebody else may, and then we will be caught up in a global prisoner's dilemma. I disagree. And let me tell you why I disagree. Because we assume here in the West that the rest of the world is as imperialistic and misanthropic as Europe and the United States. That's not true. That is not true. I mean, if you look at China, the history of China, even when it was very brutal empire, extremely authoritarian, I'm talking about, centuries ago, they chose to cut off their relations with the rest of the world. They didn't want to be imperialist. If you look at the Ottoman Empire, under which my people, the Greek people, suffered, we were slaves under the Ottoman Empire, and yet the Ottoman Empire was a paragon of humanity compared to anything Europe has ever produced. Ask the Jews. When the Jews were expelled by the Catholics in Spain, they found refuge in Thessaloniki, in Istanbul, right? And they lived in Palestine under the Ottoman Empire, the Jews were never faced a pogrom, ever, right? So the rest of the world is not as predatory as the West is. So the problem for me, is the fact that the West has a military-industrial complex, which is essential to the business model of Western capitalism. And in China, it's not true. China does not need its industrial military complex in order to maintain its growth. It doesn't. It actually harms it. President Xi would love to do away with military expenditure. If you look at the thousands of miles of super fast magnetic trains that they're producing, and the United States can't even have a 19th century train going from Washington, D.C. to New York, right? The Americans rely on building lethal weapons for their growth model. The same thing is happening with the European Union. That pathetic idiot, who is supposedly the head of the chairman of the European Union Council, Mr. Charles Michel, the other day, and I'm beyond bourgeois politeness and manners these days. I called him a stupid idiot, and I mean it, because he had the audacity to come up with a program for a plan for Europe's technological and economic advancement through creating a military-industrial complex in Europe. You won't find that in India. You will not find that in Indonesia. You will not find this in China. They have all sorts of authoritarian tendencies, and I have no doubt that if I lived in China, I would probably be in prison now. And Modi is a fascist in India. But it is only the West that relies on the mentality which, in your estimation, okay, maybe I'm being unfair to you, but this prisoner's dilemma requires people who think in the terms of the logic of the prisoner's dilemma, and it is only the West that thinks in that way. The global South doesn't. This is why the BRICS are an interesting experiment. I'm not enthusiastic about the BRICS. I think that the left has made a very big mistake to think of it as an alternative Soviet Union. No, but it is an interesting experiment because none of those people, South Africa, India, and so on, they are not interested in building up a military-industrial complex as part of their capital accumulation model.
I hear that, Yanis. I see it differently. I see that through the history of humanity, the more familiar principle of conflict over resources based on ethnic, tribal, national, regional identities, that precedes the sorts of cultures that you're talking about that arose in the West and led to the worst forms of imperialism that we've ever seen. And as we look ahead, given the many ecological crises that are coming our way and already we're living through, there are going to be conflicts over resources. It's going to be harder to get access to fresh water, food. There's going to be a scramble for land. Now, unless you find ways of dealing with those problems cooperatively, building this active peace culturally and in terms of the international architecture for decision making, you are going to have conflict. And as soon as there's conflict, you get arms races. And that's where all the resources end up going, even if the people...
I disagree with you, Rob. I really deeply disagree with you. The reason why we have this conflict and climate catastrophe is because of European and American imperialism. The rest of the world have shown over the last 2,000 years a remarkable capacity to cooperate. Whether we are talking about Africa, you're projecting our European nastiness onto other people. If you look at Northern Africa, if you look at Southern Africa, whenever there were conflicts over resources, water, whatever, in the Sahara and so on, they found remarkably harmonious ways of dealing with them. Even under the Ottoman Empire, in China, in India, it was only when the Europeans, the East India Company, and ExxonMobil, when they meddle, they create these conflicts, which then European and American elites blame on the backwardness of the brown people. I will not participate in this.
I mean, I think there's many examples of empire and imperialism across the world, not just in Europe. And there's nothing biologically different about Europeans. That's the whole point. What happened in Europe was a kind of confluence of memes. It was not genetic evolution, but mimetic evolution.
From Genghis Khan to today's Asia, right? It is simply to mistake the manner in which Malaysia, China, South Korea, even though they have huge differences, they seem perfectly capable of cooperating with one another in the way you want. The only impediment to cooperation is American and European imperialism.
But wasn't the imperialism fast growing after the industrial revolutions of mainly Europe, in that they developed steel and steam as the fundamental breakthrough in technology, and rapidly ran out of enough resources domestically to feed their industries, hence the need for importing of vast amounts of raw materials from around the world. And so the whole of European industry basically relies on the importation of raw materials from the rest of the world, hence the need for military strength in order to be able to ensure those supplies going to the industrial needs. And so
but there's the other dimension. This is of course correct, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Of course, this is correct. But there is a second dimension to imperialism, which is even more powerful and more misanthropic and destructive. It's not so much that Britain ran out of coal. The Industrial Revolution did not run out of coal. What the Industrial Revolution ran out of, capitalism ran out of, was it ran out of markets, because the class struggle, the class structure of British capitalism deprived the British working class the spending power which was necessary to absorb all the products of British industry. So then the Royal Navy had to go out there and conquer lands, not so much for their primary resources, but in order to create markets for the cotton goods that were produced in Manchester. So initially it was extractive, going conquering Latin America to get its gold, conquering other places to get their cotton and their cocoa and their coffee beans and all that. But primarily the reason why capitalism is like a shark that needs to keep moving, otherwise it dies, is because it cannot create domestically enough demand for the products of the capitalist machinery. So it needs to keep spreading like a virus to other parts of the world to create markets. Now, if you look at, people, right-wingers, establishment figures celebrate the lifting of so many billions of people out of poverty. Well, because of globalization, globalized capitalism. Well, that's true, but 95% of them were Chinese. And the Chinese managed to rise them to rise above poverty and to create all this wealth on the basis of a model which was not imperialist, which was not. It didn't need to conquer. They didn't need to kill any prime minister anywhere in the world, or to or roll tanks in any country around the world in order to create markets for themselves. And to assume that they would do the same thing as the Americans or the British would, I think this is simply projecting onto them the aspects of European and American capitalism and imperialism, which are responsible for the fact that now we're a species facing extinction.
The memes that arose in Europe, the culture that arose in Europe, that can arise anywhere, and it only has to arise once in one place with sufficient power to then begin forcing other people to play the prisoner's dilemma game. People can get drawn into the game.
You're falling into the trap of the Washington Consensus now by saying that, you see, the Chinese are developing, so the Thucydides hypothesis says that we are going to have a problem with them, and if we do not develop nuclear weapons, and if we are not predatory, they will be, and we will all become Chinamen. Yeah, you're falling into that trap. Don't.
No, what I'm doing is I'm trying to recognize the power of that logic. I think it's too easy to just deny the logic. I think the logic
It's
is
completely
powerful,
powerless.
and we have to
It is an
transcend the logic.
imperialist logic. It's an imperialist
My
logic that
conclusion is
needs
very
support.
different, Yanis. I arrive at a very different conclusion to the Washington Consensus.
So
Extremely
what
wealthy
is your
nation.
conclusion? And why is it different to that of Joe Biden today? Because what Joe Biden is arguing today for is a new World Trade Organization, a new United Nations, which is going to be more fair and will not allow the Chinese to have surpluses. What is
We
your
need something,
suggestion?
Yanis, that we've never had before. And I think it takes two forms. It takes a form of a cultural enlightenment and an international system which is designed for peace and cooperation. Because
Well, we have the United Nations.
precisely
If you
because
go,
we
if you
are.
go into the
But
United
Yanis,
Nations
let me finish the
and you
point, and
talk
then
to
I'll
the
let you
people
say
from
it. Precisely because we are cognizant of the fact that for the first time in history, we cannot repeat the patterns of the past in terms of conflict, because if we do, we wipe ourselves out. That is the motivation to put together an international architecture that
Instead,
actually.
you have low-level wars going on forever. The Ukraine war, I hope it finished tomorrow, but it won't. That could go on forever.
Yeah.
And that then is fed by an arms industry. And at the same time, all the propaganda that we're all receiving all the time is that somehow or other China is our new competitor on everything. And I hear some completely deranged members of parliament getting up in the House of Commons telling us we've got to stand up to China and we've got to spend far more on defense so we can deal with the Chinese threat. I mean, they're completely deranged. And I remember the Chinese ambassador said to me some years ago, he said, Jeremy, why have you got an aircraft carrier patrolling up and down our coast? And I said, well, two things really. First of all, I haven't got an aircraft carrier of any sort, and I don't think it should be there anyway. And secondly, I think it's mad. And he said, could you let the British government know that for your 2 aircraft carriers, we've got 100? I mean, the idea is just crazy. But Yanis is right about the issue of building up this arms race idea. Presumably is meant to either throw China into a different direction or to say, well, actually, we're prepared to go to war with China. I don't think anybody is really prepared to go to war with China because they know what the consequence of that would be. But also, does China actually want to go to war with anybody?
Absolutely not.
Yeah,
they're a trading nation.
Exactly.
They just want to sell stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And the idea that they are building up their military and they would want that the threat. I mean, I was in Australia recently where the big issue, of course, is this ridiculous AUKUS deal between the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia, where the Australians are paying $360 billion for submarines that are completely and utterly useless. And the rationale there is that the Chinese will interrupt the trade routes around the South China Seas. And the question is, why on earth would they do that? They want to use those trade routes to sell their wares, and they're very good at producing stuff.
And the Australian
it's just
economic model, and the Australian economic model depends on trade with China anyway.
Indeed. So the Australians are committing suicide. There's no doubt of that. Yeah. But that's because this is what they've been told to do by Washington, and they are just proceeding to do it. They did it in Gallipoli under Winston Churchill. They are now doing it under Joe Biden, and they will do it under Donald Trump tomorrow because they have become vassals. And the United Kingdom, by the way, is not far off under the pretense of the special relationship. But going back to look, there is no doubt that we need to re-energize the United Nations. If you go into the United Nations, and I was there in November, and I was very struck by this, I talked to representatives of different countries in the United Nations, from Africa, from Asia, very different countries, politically, ideologically. As I've said before, I consider Modi, the Prime Minister of India, to be a fascist, who is creating racial tensions in order to exploit it, in order to become more authoritarian. But nevertheless, Even when you speak to Indian diplomats representing that government, or to the Chinese, or to Nigerians, or to South Africans, or to people from South America, they love what you are saying, Raul. They want cooperation. They do not want conflict. But you have a hardcore of European and American, Canadian and Australian representatives there who are doing their utmost to ensure that there is never any international cooperation, and that there is the Five Eyes, when the Five Eyes meaning the five intelligence services of the Anglosphere. That is there is the military representation of this. There's a multinational conglomerate representation of this, and they will do everything to ensure that the United Nations doesn't operate. So we don't need another organization. We have the United Nations. We simply need, as British, as Canadians, as Australians, as Europeans, to revolt against our governments, take over, and make the United Nations work, because the rest of the world are ready for it.
I mean, that all sounds very good. I'm very much behind that plan. My only doubt, Yanis, is part of the reading of the global situation now. It seems quite short term in that we've had a global superpower in the United States for getting close to a century, and that changes the incentives for every other country. That changes the way people think about peace. And of course, it's more appealing to think about cooperation when you are not the superpower. And as we enter a multipolar world, the dynamics change. I want in every country populations to take ownership democratically of resources and of decision making. But I do see that we need a sort of new kind of international cooperation, which we haven't seen before, which is deeper and more effective and more binding, given the scale of technologies. Now, I know we're running out of time, and this is such a big, important topic. So I don't want to kind of hog it anymore, but I just want to say, Jeremy, do you have any final words before I know you have to leave?
We need better information. We need better education. We need the language of peace to return. We need to recognize that global inequality and environmental disaster are not going to be dealt with by this rapid increase in arms expenditure and the greed of the biggest global corporations. So it is about global movements for peace and for justice that are absolutely crucial and essential to everything that we do. And re-energizing the UN is part of that. Re-energizing that idea of cooperation is a very important part of that. And remember, politics can change very quickly. Trump may well win in the USA. All his nonsensical rhetoric is not going to put food on the table, is not going to give health care to the very poorest in the USA. And those popular movements can turn very quickly into something actually quite progressive, which is demanding social justice for people.
Well, very briefly, I hope that the war in Gaza, the massacre, it's not even a war, the pictures of the maimed children somehow get into the conscience of people who are not part of our movement, who are not left-wingers, and who realize that their own regimes, their own political parties, are dragging them towards a misanthropic equilibrium that they do not want to have any part of, and demand that their government in Britain, in France, in Germany, we exit this cabal of NATO, warmongering, industrial complex driven precursors of just, a generalized conflict from which we won't even be able to extract a proper discussion about whether we want socialism or whether we want democracy or whether we want social democracy. The things that people are concerned about are not even on the agenda of the people who are running the show. And those people, independently of whether they agree with us or not, about socialism, about this, that, and the other, they have to take control of their governments. Just take back control of their governments. That slogan of the Brexiteers was so successful because get back control is what the demos needs so that democracy can function again. Of course, it was usurped by people like Farage and Boris Johnson. We need to get back control of getting back control.
One last thought, if I may, Yanis and Raoul. I've been on all these demonstrations over Gaza for the past 6 months. I've been to a very large number of public meetings and so on. And what I've noticed is a difference in that the people coming are from a very broad background of life and walks of life, and actually quite a wide variety of political views. There is a growing radical movement, irrespective of political parties. It's not a majority, but it's a significant one, who want to see things differently, are unbelievably shocked by the inhumanity of what's happening in Gaza, and likewise in Ukraine, and in the horrors of all the wars that are going on. I think there are some grounds for hope.
Well, my final word is just to take the opportunity to say, Jeremy, thank you for just a lifetime of fighting for peace against injustice, for showing so much courage as leader of the Labour Party. You remain a symbol of hope and inspiration for so many, including myself. Thank you for all you do. And as long as there are people like you, then there is genuine hope and there is an alternative. And it's an honor to speak with you today.
Here. Nice to be with you. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe to our channel.